This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. As always, we'll talk about the week's news with Colin McEnroe. He's host of The Colin McEnroe Show here on WNPR. Hello there, Colin.
And future host of Face the Facts. Although we're going to reformat it. It's going to be more like Holy Moly. We're going to have giant lawn darts with politicians strapped to them.
I would totally watch that on a Sunday morning.
It's the jarts.
It's the charts. We do it in black and white. I like it. Colin McEnroe is here. Also, Dan Harr is here. He's editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media. Hello there, Danny.
Good morning. How's it going?
It's going fine, I think.
My show will be called Face Max Reiss.
Face Max Reiss. And Daniela Altamari is here. She's State House reporter at the Hartford Courant. Hello there, Daniela.
Hi.
Okay, so I guess we will start with the big news of the day. Just out today, Governor Ned Lamont is giving his office a bit of a facelift, and we'll talk about the new carpeting and wallpaper in just a minute. But he's also shaking up the personnel. He's bringing in former State Senator Jonathan Harris as senior advisor. And yes, he's hiring former Wheelhouse guest host Max Reiss to be his communications director. This now makes 3 different Wheelhouse guest hosts who've gone on to work in Democratic administrations. So I'll just leave that there. There's also this fact, which, to be honest, surprised the heck out of me. NBC Connecticut will continue to employ Max as a reporter for the next 2 weeks before he starts his new job. So he won't be assigned any political stories, from what I understand. My guess is mostly parades and thunderstorm cleanup and building fires and cats stuck up in trees. But still, Colin, that seems like a bit of a problematic alliance between media and government. What do you make of all of this news this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel as though TV has slightly different standards. As you know, I have crabbed about the fact that during his own campaign season, Joe Ganim is an analyst, a political analyst on another Sunday morning show, Dennis House's, over on FSB. So I don't know. They got different rules. First of all, it may be a bigger story for us than it is for the average person. These are kind of the people that, first of all, Max is a colleague and somebody we all really like a lot. And I like him. I value his intelligence and his acumen. I thought he's been a terrific political reporter. And then, these are the people from whom we get our information. I will say that it can be a little tricky interpreting something like this. And we were saying this out in the newsroom. There have been rumblings for like a couple of months that Colleen Flanagan Johnson wanted to get out of the Lamont administration, wanted to go someplace else. So the idea that, Ned is booting both her and Maribel Lalouse, who was one step down as, I don't know what the title is, but she's basically the sort of
Communications director.
The communications director? Mm-hmm. Okay. So she was like kind of the Sarah Sanders of the Lamont administration.
Maribel's going to love
that's a really terrible analogy.
Talk about kicking someone when they're down.
The point is, they're both leaving. She's going over to work with David Lehman at the Department of Economic Development. Colleen is going back to the private sector. Max is coming in to take Colleen's job. The optics of this are terrible. It's obviously clear that the Lamont administration has stumbled pretty badly. They have really not had a great first term. It's questionable that they will ever get anything with tolls, which was turned into their signature issue kind of by mistake. And it looks like they kicked out 2 women, and brought in a man. And now I don't think that's really what happened. I think actually this happened in a somewhat more organic way, but you have to pay attention to how things look too. It doesn't look good at all to do something like that. And to the extent that this is a shakeup or it is an attempt to create, to use Johanna Hayes' term about her shakeup, a new footprint. The problems that they had were not the kind of outward-facing problems. I mean, I wouldn't say it was a great communications operation with the press and with the public. The problems that they've been having have been at the state capitol. That's where most of the problems have been occurring. So the change there is to move Jonathan in there to be the wise old man of the administration. Either I'm getting older or wise old men are getting younger or something. And restructure Paul Mounds' job a little bit. I think so. He reports to somebody. They probably need more than that. That's probably not going to do it, but whatever. I'll pass the baton. Somebody else.
Dan, go ahead.
So the players aside, and a lot of this is, as Colin said, for us, it's sort of inside baseball. We know all the players and who they are and everything. The underlying issue is I think there's been both some missteps, public-facing and non-public facing, a little bit of each. Some of the missteps have been small, just little things like the governor isn't going to say this now. And he says it now. Well, okay, he's not on message discipline. You can't blame that on the communications team, but it's a way of communicating that. There needs to be more of an understanding that the governor is not a disciplined speaker.
He needs to communicate with his communications team.
Well, that's right. And in other words, right. So, or they could shut him up more, or they could stop shutting him up, which we prefer, and just say, we don't know what's going to happen. But I don't think those things amount to a huge problem. The biggest issue, as Colin said, is tolls, and they haven't gotten that major initiative done. Jonathan Harris was brought in to get a tolls vote, and it was brought in the middle of the session from Office of Policy and Management, where he had a job that I don't believe anybody understood, probably including him. I'm not sure what the job was, but whatever, it was a good job. And he was brought in to get a tolls vote. That didn't happen. So I hardly think that this is a problem, a change arising from the failure to get a tolls vote.
Well, let me just ask, and Danielle, you know all of these insiders, and you've dealt with some of them on both sides of the thing. Just before I get your take on this larger issue, the shuffling of the deck chairs here, there's the question, of course, of somebody who's been covering politics go over to be the communications director, what exactly that means for outward-facing communications, but maybe communications at the Capitol as well. Then there's someone like Jonathan Harris, who has, let's just say, held many positions in state government over the years, including, as Dan just said, one recently that we weren't entirely sure of what it is. We do in Connecticut seem to be continually shuffling the deck chairs of the same groups of people, hoping for some different outcome, and we don't seem to necessarily be getting any sort of different outcome. Do you see a different outcome here with this latest shakeup?
Who knows? I mean, it's too soon to tell what the outcome will be. But, you have a guy like Lamont who did come from the outside, although he's been around for a while in politics at least. It's the whole idea that, any wealthy person can run for anything, but there is a lot of learning to be done. And he does seem to have some difficulties connecting with some of the members of the legislature. We had Governor Malloy, who also had his difficulties connecting with the legislature for very different reasons. So they bring in Jonathan Harris to sort of help guide him and, maybe smooth over some of those relationships. Will it work? I don't know.
I mean, in a way, we should first of all say Jonathan has been a lot of things. He was mayor of West Hartford. He was state senator from West Hartford, too, and then has gone into a whole series of appointed positions. He was also over at Democratic State Central at a very unfortunate time to be there, the time when they seemed to be trying to, at the time in which the largest elections enforcement fine in Connecticut history was levied against the Democratic State Central Committee. For all of that, in a way, you could say that Lamont's problem has kind of been that he didn't have enough familiar faces in these deck chairs. I mean, his original group going in there was a bunch of people who didn't really know the terrain very well, and he still has a chief of staff who, as far as I can tell, has zero experience dealing with this particular terrain. It could be that he's still short one or two familiar faces, the kind of people who can walk, up or down a floor at the state capitol and go and talk to people and, get some communication going with the legislature.
I was just going to ask you, though, Daniela, I mean, 8 years of the Malloy administration and an inability necessarily to connect with state lawmakers, and now you see the same thing in the Lamont administration. Given some of Dan Malloy's personality issues that maybe made it hard for him to warm up to people, and given some of Ned Lamont's communication issues or his outsider status, could it just be that the legislature is the problem? That maybe they don't want to work with any Democratic governor or anybody at all?
Sure. I mean, definitely the legislature is made up of lots of different personalities, and there are real rifts within the quote-unquote legislature, within the Democratic Party of the legislature. There are big ideological divisions that some agree with Lamont's approach, some don't. Some, there's a real sort of a very broad mix, and that's just among the Democrats. And then you have the Republican side as well. So it's certainly complicated. There's a lot of personalities, a ton of egos, and you throw all that together, and sure, there's going to be strife.
The moderate Republican model, the John Rowland, Charlie Baker, moderate Republican in a blue state working with the Democrats, icing out the legislative Republicans, is a model that seems to work. We ran into a bit of a problem with Rowland, not only the not only the indictable offenses, but also that the way he liked to spend money was a problem, and that played into. So it works both ways. In other words, he worked very well with Democratic legislators to waste a lot of state money and to not spend money on the pensions, which is what we needed to do, and that was bipartisan. And so if we're talking about working together and getting along, that model works. If we're talking about other dangers that arise from that, which we now do not have because we have this clashing, then that's just government at work or not at work. I think a little too much can be made of this. I think in the big picture, these sorts of changes happen, and maybe this one happened a few months earlier than we might have expected. But
I'm wondering, maybe, Colin, if we can turn to the next thing. I mean, Dan was talking about how John Rowland spent money, maybe being a little bit of a problem. I think that might be an understatement. But we have our friend Daniela and others reporting this week on Governor Lamont, who has a lot of personal money. I mean, John Rowland famously did not, which is why he periodically would find ways to take money from the till while he was in office. Ned Lamont has no problem actually saying, hey, I'll write a check for this, even if I'm governor. And he wants to spend his own money to redecorate the office and to put on a concert?
Right. So, I mean, in general, I think this is a good thing. Some Republicans have tried to make some kind of issue of this, comparing it to the Gilded Age. I guess Vinnie Candelaria is the one who's kicking up a fuss about this. I mean, there's obviously a certain quality of noblesse oblige that accompanies this, but I think it's fine. I think if he wants to fix up the office and pay for it, I don't see any particular harm there. And yes, God knows it is an improvement over, if you recall, during the Rowland administration, we were constantly trying to figure out what was going on with the mansion fund, which was this. It was like a slush fund where money would kind of pour in to fix up the mansion. We were never entirely clear about where that money was going or whether it was going to the mansion or not. So, look, he wants to spend his own money. I think that's fine. And yeah, now he wants to do this Ned Stock thing where he's going to celebrate the anniversary of Woodstock with the Battle of the Bands, which seems like a real 70s idea to me somehow.
They have to cover Woodstock songs. That's the rule.
Is that
to
is that
be
the
on
rule?
stage? You have to cover.
Are you going to be one of the judges? I could see you as one of the judges.
George Logan is going to win going away. There's no question about it.
It's not just legislators playing.
I understand. I don't care who it is. He wins with that rendition of the Star Spangled Banner.
So I'm confused, Daniela. So he's putting up his own money because he wants to have a battle of the bands?
I guess. I mean, I think, he went out there, he did an appearance out there, and he told the local people in Woodstock that that's what he wants to do.
Putting up $30,000 of his own money to put on something that's going to be kind of like a Woodstock, but only with a bunch of cover bands.
I think so. I think that's the idea.
Are
looking skeptical. We're not on Facebook or
no, we're not on Facebook Live
public
today
TV
to be able to see my face right now.
The face there is telling a story.
Don't eat the purple cortisone.
Is that in terms of the way that lawmakers are looking at that, Daniela? Is that different than the way that they might be looking at him paying for his own office renovations?
I think it's sort of all part of the same storyline to some degree. And, even his donations to charity. I mean, you look at other people who have come into office with tremendous wealth. Bloomberg in New York perfected this. He handed out money to everyone and anyone, charitable causes, flying his staff on private jets. I mean, I don't think Lamont is at that level and would do that. But it's sort of a wealthy guy in office. He's got the money. Why not?
But there's a slight tenure to all of this, right? I mean, there's a way in which, just in the same way that Ned fervently embraced Hamilton in a way that made you think it was the first musical he'd seen since the original production of Showboat or something, that he's kind of excited about this, but in the way of a guy who's maybe been in a little bit of a bubble and maybe hasn't gone to a lot of stuff. I just don't think Ned's out there at Coachella every year. And so, I mean, it's sort of antithetical to the spirit of Woodstock to have bands competing for a pot of money with judges, one of whom will be Ned. If you think of sort of what's nice about music festivals these days, or even like the thing that Jim Chapdelaine does every year, there's sort of a point where, 6 or 7 musicians from different bands are out on stage doing For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, and then Tang Sauce, a local hip-hop artist, comes out and starts rapping over the instrumentals. I mean, some of the fun of a music festival is not people competing with one another for a pot of money, but sort of when they all kind of get together and do kind of cool stuff synergistically. So, but anyway, it's his music festival. It's Ned Stock. He can do it the way he wants.
I want to know about the grass wallpaper. is that actual real growing grass? Because there was just in Stanford, which I reported about, a bio-fashion summit, and it's still at the Stanford Mall. There's a activity there around biological rejuvenatable fashion industry coming to Connecticut. And one of the people there, one of the young designers, who's a highly celebrated young designer, makes wool garments that sprout grass out of them. So I want to know whether Lamont's biofashion, this is going to be Connecticut industry. I want to know whether Lamont's wallpaper was part of that movement, and if so, that could be a very important Connecticut link.
Well, you're a columnist. Investigate.
I'm on my way.
I'd like to know more about that. I'd also like to know a little bit more about some of the things that state lawmakers, the state government, don't necessarily want us to know about. It's been a bad year so far for open government in the state. As mentioned previously in the show, the Freedom of Information Commission felt no state lawmaker deserved its big award this year for championing government transparency. This week comes a report in the Waterbury Republican-American about town clerks charging a $20 fee for letting members of the public take their own pictures of public documents. A bill to ban that practice was raised this past session, but never came up on the House or Senate floor for a vote. This, Daniela, is just one of many storylines that we've been following in which it seems as though some of our opportunities to get the information that is publicly available to us because we, paid for it, it's being eroded at the municipal level or at the state level.
Yeah, that idea that if you snap a picture of a public document on your phone, that you should be charged. That's Gannon Long was the first one of. She's from Hartford, and she was the first one to sort of raise that as an issue. I think John Linder wrote a column about it that was pretty amazing. And you're thinking about you're going into your town government, you've got to look at some public records, and they're going to charge you for using your own phone, your own time to snap a picture of the document. That's pretty crazy, I think.
I'm snapping pictures here. Here it is. And
$20, $40,
this
$60.
means that I'm going to donate
pledge
that much
drive.
more to public radio and TV this year because of these pictures I'm snapping. I
We
think,
can only hope.
Yeah. Well, this arises from what this is the mentality that says we need X revenue. Mm-hmm. This is how we're going to get. And if you look at the comments that were in, was it your story?
No.
Okay, well, I don't remember whose story it was. That if you look at the comments that were in by one of the town clerks, Wallingford town clerk, you're great. It's the attitude that we need the revenue, and this is where we're going to get the revenue. And we're not thinking about this as being right and wrong or part of any philosophic system. And this is what leads to the breakdown in public information not coming from the state police, for example. This is what we think is right. The biggest, most outrageous thing that happened this year is not one that's probably on the list of things that we've been looking at. It's that the Hartford Courant won a judgment through the state Supreme Court that said you're going to get I don't say the name, the shooter in Newtown's 1,000-page records, and only you get it. And we at Hearst and you at CP Public Broadcasting, Connecticut Public Broadcasting, could not get that document.
That is right.
And you still don't have the same document the Courant had. That, to me, is a bigger outrage than any of these who's moving around and who's taking pictures stuff. That's where it really gets serious. The link is that people are doing what they think is right, and they're not thinking about the philosophic issue behind it.
First of all, I would recommend that people read Gabriella Benedictus's story in the Waterbury Republican-American, but it's also up on the Connecticut Mirror website. She goes through a whole series of things, starting with the Ray Dalio thing, which is still sticks in my craw. Let's sort of just back up and say freedom of information law, which is part of the fallout post-Watergate, is, you could argue, the most significant government reform of the last 50 years. And all they ever do, and by they I mean elected officials and people who have jobs in government at all levels, all they ever do is go to war against it. All they ever do is try to erode it and kneecap it. And it's disgusting. And we should fight them tooth and nail on every single one of these. I don't care how much money Ray Dalio gives the state. The notion that he needs exemption from freedom of information, that he is going to staff his council of hooded figures with his wife and then legislative leaders who are not going to be answerable to us at the level of freedom of information is repugnant. I don't care how much money he gives us. It means that he's an enemy of that process, an enemy of, I think, the fact that we can FOI documents, emails, stuff like that, is such an incredible check on the abuse of power. It's so important. And there's a negotiated state police provision now, part of a labor negotiation that basically allows the state police to exempt stuff from freedom of information about misconduct by officers that in the past we probably could have gotten. This just goes on all the time, every year, every session, and it's disgusting. And the people who do it should be ashamed of themselves, and the people who countenance it should be ashamed of themselves.
I'm wondering, Danielle, if this in some ways falls into the same category. Another thing the legislature failed to do before the end of the session was approve the annual bond package, a list of all the various construction projects and things that are going to be done through state borrowing. Unlike past practice, this year's package isn't likely to list the specific projects being approved. Rather, Senate President Pro Tem Martin Looney told The Current this week bond money will likely be set aside in what he called large pots and divvied up later on. The notion is that we don't necessarily need to know what all these projects are. It's just we're going to bond for a certain amount of money and we'll figure out the little niggling details later.
Yeah, and I think Colin's right. There is a certain amount of arrogance to all of this on the part of the legislative leaders when they're questioned. I mean, I remember at the end of the session we sat in the House Democrats' office and Speaker Simowitz and Majority Leader Ritter were like, what's the problem here? This guy's given us all this money. It's going to go for the public good. Why are we clamoring about this? What are we complaining about? I mean, there's a sense that, we know it's best. We'll act in the best interest of everybody. Don't worry. And you don't have to look over our shoulder and you don't have to check us. And that, I think, is correctly seen as somewhat dangerous.
Since we can't solve every problem, and at the risk of what I'm going to...
Says you.
Yes. And yes, I do says. And at the risk of some verbal abuse that I'm going to suffer during the upcoming break from Colin here, looking at the other side, yes, it is not defensible to set up government mechanisms that by their nature are secretive from the outset. But we already have a system in place of, and I could go through the alphabet soup, CERC, MIRA, all the quasi-publics, all the nonprofit providers that are doing solely public business. The apparatus of secretive government by its structure is vast and enormous. Why aren't we going after that? Why are we starting with this where somebody happens to be giving $100 million?
But we're not starting with this. We've been talking about this for quite some time and been trying to discuss this at every turn with every single one of these expenditures that goes towards something that is not transparent for government.
To me, the bigger issue, and I'm not saying that this is right, but there are ways to control this. There are rules that you can put in place that are not necessarily in the legislation when they meet. It is still a public board, and the public board can decide we're going to be transparent or we're not. I would prefer to see it. I would prefer, and so hold that system accountable. It doesn't have to be necessarily. And again, we're speaking in an ideal world here. You can't approach everyone. Why aren't we going to MDC, Metropolitan District Commission, and holding them to the exact same standards? Why aren't we going to MIRA? Why aren't we going to CERC? Why aren't we going to all the quasi-public agencies that operate?
I'll just quickly say, and I just want to give Colin a quick word on this. If you were you to roll back the tape on the Wheelhouse, we may have mentioned the MDC in the past on this in this very particular issue.
Can we do the rollback sound?
I mean, these quasi-publics have taken years off my life. I've spent so much time inveighing against exactly this process. I would throw in today's news the Connecticut Lottery Corporation, and it's not just today.
How could I forget?
Yeah. It's not just today. The running of the Connecticut Lottery has been a certain kind of show, and I can't say the first word of this, pretty much from Jump Street, right? And that's another quasi-public where it's hard to get information, and they act like deranged animals. So and I just want to say one more thing about he gave us a lot of money, all right? And this is an offensive analogy I'm about to make, but I'm going to make it anyway. We're seeing, in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, what happens when somebody with a lot of money can buy a different public process for himself. That's what happened in Florida. Jeffrey Epstein was able to take a lot of money and a lot of influence and buy a kind of criminal jurisprudence that is not available to the average person.
That's not offensive. That's ridiculous.
And
Ray
Dalio...
One guy is committing a heinous crime and buying his way, and the other guy guy walks into a state where he's made $18 billion and he sees, well, gee whiz, it's not working. I could move to Florida like the rest of my friends, or I could actually do something about it.
I'm going to cut this off in 20 seconds. Go ahead, Colin.
But he can't spend $100 million and buy himself an exemption from a law. You
He's
shouldn't
not
be
buying an exemption.
He
He's
is.
trying to get something done in a state that can't even pass basic laws that move the state forward.
There's
are
a price tag on our freedom of information.
We are going to take a break, and they can continue this while we're in our break. Colin McEnroe is the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Danny Haar is the host of Face the Facts. No, I'm sorry. Danny Haar is editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media.
He wants that job.
Daniela Altamari, State House reporter at the Hartford Courant. We'll be back and talk a lot more about the week's news here in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. It's getting hot in here, not just because it's hot outside. We're talking today with Danny Haar, editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media, also with Daniela Altamari, State House reporter at the Hartford Courant, and, of course, with our own Colin McEnroe. Colin, what's on your show today?
Well, so Playhouse on Park, which is a kind of up-and-coming and kind of punching above its own weight theater company in West Hartford, is putting on the Scottsboro Boys. Scottsboro Boys is a musical version, a Cantor and Ebb musical about one of the more horrific miscarriages of justice of the 20th century. 9 young black men in the South accused very implausibly of rape and held in jail for a very long time. So this is a difficult thing to stage at all, put on as a musical. It's also told through the device of minstrelsy. So we're going to talk about all that. It's kind of, it's kind of To Kill a Mockingbird without the white savior narrative. There's like no white savior, really. And so we're going to have some of the creative team behind it, but also they've been having these mediators who talk to the audience afterwards, and they're mostly judges, prosecutors, people like that. So Gail Hardy, who's the lead state's attorney in Hartford, has been one of those, and she is going to join us as well.
That is a fascinating program. So that's coming up today at 1 o'clock on the Colin McEnroe Show. So there's no date set for lawmakers to take up Governor Lamont's highway toll plan. Here's Lamont speaking on Tuesday about the status of negotiations with legislative leaders over how to pay for transportation infrastructure improvements.
We all agree we need additional revenues to fix our roads and bridges and speed up our rail. That's agreed to. How you pay for it, what's the mix of borrowing, what's the mix of tolling, how do we put that together, what incentives can we also offer, like a reduction in the income tax. Those are all part of the discussion.
Daniela, that clip from Ned Lamont, I believe, comes from earlier this week, but it sounds an awful lot like clips we've been hearing from the governor for the last couple months. It doesn't seem as though the needle has moved very far on this idea of getting tolls in the state to pay for transportation infrastructure improvements, or that indeed any needle has moved to pay for those improvements, tolls notwithstanding.
You're exactly right. I mean, if the needle had moved, we'd have a vote, right? I mean, there's nobody's budging.
So what's happening? Why is nothing happening at this point, best as you can tell?
I think there are a lot of people in that building that are not convinced, and he's tried everything. He went before them, and towards the end of the session, Danny's shaking his head.
Shaking his head. I can't wait.
And he made all these promises to them, and he kind of, some people said he kind of groveled in front of them, and that didn't work. And he's tried all kinds of different strategies, and nothing's worked. What's your strategy, Danny?
Are in place. The leadership in the Senate will not bring a vote because they don't want to expose their members to what's the opposite of bipartisan? Unipartisan?
Partisan.
There you go. Partisan. To a strictly partisan vote. It's that simple. The votes, if they held a vote today, tolls would be in place. The votes are in place, and so again, some of us have spent. This is like Fed watching.
Well, they are and they aren't. There's sort of a Schrodinger quality to this, right? They are and they aren't. They're in place, but Marty Looney is never going to ask them to cast those.
The
votes.
cat is still alive.
Yeah.
So that's exactly right. He's not going to ask them to cast a vote. And now, apparently, according to Paz's story, the latest is that he wants to see some Republicans on the bill.
Right. He does not want his people dying alone on this hill. Well, good luck getting some Republicans. I mean, what incentive do they have to come over there and die on the hill with Marty and his people?
To say that there aren't the votes are in place. It's that the process doesn't work.
We're a tree to fall in the forest, Danny.
Yes.
And no one was there to hear it.
Did Ray Dalio own the forest?
They're quantum votes.
It really is a question of whether or not we're going to have a discussion about the votes are there, but we're just not going to take a vote. The Democratic legislature is in control of this process.
Yes.
If they would like to take a vote in order to cash in those votes that the governor would like to have them take, then they could do such a thing, and they could have a plan in place.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter if they have the votes. Until or unless they do the vote thing, it don't matter.
Right, and Daniela, I mean, I think it's fair to say Marty Looney knows what it's like to go it alone. I mean, they frequently go it alone. They frequently have strictly partisan votes, where they don't get any Republican cooperation at all. The fact that he's not willing to do it this time, I think, is an indication of the lack of will. If this was something they really wanted to do, they would do it and they would take their medicine, and they're just not willing to.
I mean, I don't know. Where does Bob Duff stand on this? Has he come out on tolls? When
I said the Senate leadership, I meant the Senate leadership,
Okay.
not just Marty Looney.
Okay.
And but he's not the boss. He's the number 2 guy, but I don't think he's helping. Let's put it that way. These are all people who, if the vote were happening, would vote for tolls. The votes are, and this is what was so baffling to the Lamont people at the end of the session, when it was like, well, wait a minute, we have a list of senators here who are for it, and the list would suddenly change, every day, and it didn't change. It changed, but it didn't change.
Wait a minute, we've got a list of people who are going to vote for this thing.
So we read this week our friend Jim Cameron, who covers commuter issues down in the southwest corner of the state. Daniela asking the big question, though, if we don't get tolls, what exactly is Plan B? He's asking the questions, where do we find the money? Well, do we find them from operations at the state DOT? Do we raise the gas tax? Do we raise the sales tax? Do we raise the income tax? Do we raise fares and cut services? Do we do some partial tolling? I mean, what are people talking about in terms of how we find the money to do the thing we need to do if we don't have money from tolls?
As far as I know, and Danny might know more, but as far as I know, they're not talking about any other options, right? I mean, the Republicans have their plan, and that's it. Nobody's saying that I've heard that we're going to raise the sales tax or we're going to do these other things.
And the Republican plan is, and unless I'm missing something, is to borrow more money to do this.
Yeah. To prioritize transportation.
Transportation within the mix of borrowing that we
Yes.
do. The governor has said we're going to do less overall borrowing because we have too big a state debt load already, which probably is a truth in some way. The Republicans say borrow more. I don't know.
The governor is already on pace to borrow the low amount of money for general government that the Republicans want to do. And so it's a ridiculous statement. The bottom line is that this is only about trust that the government can handle the new money. That's all it is. This isn't about what's the best way to spend $800 million. This is if you need to get $800 million for highways, additional, there's 2 ways to get it. One is to toll, in which costs the state taxpayers $500 million because you get $350 and then $50 to run it from outside the state, truckers and all that stuff, and out-of-state motorists. So $500 million to get $800 million is Plan A. Plan B is if you borrow it at today's rates over a 20-year payback, you're paying $1.2 billion. So it's $500 million or $1.2 billion. Well, the Republicans aren't stupid, most of them, and so they're. No, they are. They're smart. They know the numbers. The problem is that they can't trust government. And Lamont's decision to take $58 million from the car sales tax fund that was supposed to go to transportation and divert it back into the general fund is going to come out as the stupidest $58 million savings in the history of Connecticut government, because he's not going to get tolls because of that. Because that stunt, while falling within the letter of the law, violated the spirit of the referendum that we passed in November that said money for transportation has to be spent on transportation. And yes, it did not violate the law because it was never in the box. So the lockbox didn't fail. It wasn't in the box. But that's going to be a dumb move.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, hats off to Jim Cameron writing the only grown-up piece. As Daniela said, there hasn't really been any kind of public commentary out of our elected officials about what to do if you don't get tolls. But it seems kind of clear, barring some deus ex machina, that we're not going to get tolls. And nobody but except Jim Cameron, who, just to be clear, is a mass transportation advocate, not an elected official or anything like that, just writing an op-ed piece. Yeah. So, that's the only document I've seen that sheds any light on it whatsoever. You run down all those options. They're all unpalatable for one reason or another. I mean, to tell you the truth, probably, this will set Danny off, but
Thanks.
probably
That's
the most responsible thing to do would be to raise the gas tax. But that's politically impossible.
Mileage tax works better than a gas tax.
Yeah, but they think that's Big Brother, right? The mileage tax, like, going to monitor where you're going to drive and stuff like that. No, I'm fine with it. I'm fine. Don't make that face at me. I'm fine with it. But that's also politically,
worse than tolls. Mileage tax is worse than tolls.
Yes.
We've got to take a break very quickly, but I know you wanted to mention this, Danny, while we're talking about transportation. We're reading in the New Haven Register, tweet, New Haven Airport wins lawsuit on runway expansion. This is something that the New Haven area has been looking for a long time. In that particular neighborhood, it's sort of odd to see an airport. And the question has been, can we extend the runway and turn Tweed into an actual real airport that can take bigger planes and get more traffic, make New Haven a little bit more of a hub? The location of the place is a little strange. You see this as a big deal.
This is an economic imperative versus a democratic principle. You can't take away from states the right to say this is how we're going to regulate major. It's like major. I call it zoning. It's bigger than zoning. States have to have that right, but yet it's an economic imperative that was being blocked by the two most powerful senators, because it happens that who knew Tweed Airport would fall in the district of both the Republican leader and the Democratic leader of the Senate, and so it does, and so they don't want the expansion. I would not be surprised if the Supreme Court does take this up. I don't think that the Attorney General Tong is going to bring. He seemed to be hinting.
Ned told him not to.
Well, that's right, and he seemed to be hinting that maybe he's not going to do it. But it's a really big issue of two conflicting principles of the sort that the Supreme Court might take up.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, there's a little bit more to talk about new houses for the University of Connecticut. Also, we'll have some of our grievances and our feats of strength. We're talking with Danny Haar from Hearst Connecticut Media, with Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant, also Colin McEnroe from here at Connecticut Public Radio, here in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news with Danny Haar from Hearst Connecticut Media, Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant, and Colin McEnroe from WNPR. When the new UConn president starts the job on August 1st, he won't be living in the same house as the old president. The university's Board of Trustees recently approved spending nearly $750,000 to purchase a new presidential residence in Storrs. There's already another one in Hartford. So the question is, why shouldn't we expect someone who's going to earn $650,000 a year annually to pay for his own public housing? This is something that just keeps coming up, Daniela. Whether or not UConn has enough houses to house all the presidents, ex-presidents, I don't know, football coaches, anything else. There probably is a little bit of question that people have about why indeed we have to pay so much for yet another presidential palace.
Yeah, I think some college presidents, it must be in their contracts or something, where they get these elaborate homes to entertain in, or remember Michael Hogan and the famous cardboard statue and all that. I mean, it's there is a tradition there. I guess it's
a tradition, and I have a feeling somehow I'm going to turn to Colin here, because I have a feeling Danny is going to say something that is going to upset me about this. But go ahead, Dan, or go ahead, Colin.
Right. So
I'm going to wait for Dan to
just to put
upset
things
us
in
at the end of this.
perspective. We currently have two presidential mansions. We have one called Oak Hill, which is where Susan Herbst has been living, although Michael Hogan wouldn't live there because he said there was mold or something like that. And then we have the one
the grass wallpaper takes care of that.
That's right. There we go. And then we have the one in Hartford, which I think was paid for by the UConn Foundation. Another council of hooded figures whose activities are not amenable to FOI. And I mean, look, first of all, I don't want to rain on Katsoulias's parade. He's the new president. He seems like a really interesting guy, actually. And I mean, I have a whole take on him that I'm going to put in my newsletter this week. So, but it does seem like really we need another mansion for some reason. Okay. And it does seem also as though if UConn were a state agency, we'd really be, I mean, it is a state agency, but if we're a typical state agency, we'd really be angry at all. It's just constant, this constant bleed of money and grabbing stuff out of the cookie jar and asking for these lavish accoutrements. And it really, given the fact that this university is facing pretty huge deficits on the actual sort of UConn side, I think it's $19 million, not counting the health center, $19 million. They don't have a lot of money to be spreading around on lavish gestures. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of hoping this new guy is going to be a different kind of president, and that I'll be less offended by his approach. But I'm hoping.
I also, they say, this also comes at the same time that the state university system is bleeding money.
Right.
There's $12 million shortfall for the community college system. This is something that is meant to educate our next workforce. It is much more affordable than the University of Connecticut is, even for in-state students. And that is a system, Colin, that people have been saying has been long starved because of our attention to the University of Connecticut.
Which is absolutely, I think, a legitimate complaint. And certainly the optics of a new $740,000 gubernatorial mansion are terrible. At a moment like this, when, as you say, that state university system is gasping for air, UConn itself is in the middle of a tuition expansion. It's a multi-year tuition increase and facing a deficit. The optics are terrible. And as usual, the UConn board of directors, they just do whatever they want.
The question isn't why is UConn spending $740,000 on an $800,000 house, which is where it was appraised at, for the president, because that's sort of a normal course of business thing. The question is, why is it going to cost $1 million to fix up a 45-year-old house that's, 3 bedrooms, that Oak Hill, the existing president's house? Why did it get $1 million in disrepair? I don't even know what I'd do with $1 million to fix up my house, although I probably need it. A house of basically the same size.
You spent $400,000 on your front door. I just want to point that out.
But I actually did, depending on the price of my labor. But, I should have hired Max Reiss.
Okay, we'll move on from UConn housing, and Danielle, maybe you can just give us a quick review here. We've been talking a lot about the new casino in Springfield, whether or not it's doing terribly well. I'll ask Danielle in a second to find out whether or not we know anything else about state gambling revenues here at the state. New casinos coming, but there is this new, I guess, Wynn Casino, or not exactly Wynn Casino, in Everett, Massachusetts.
Oh, it's Wynn.
That's looming over the skyline of East Boston and
Yes.
in Winthrop and the harbor there. What do you think?
I went
with
there.
a Y, we should say.
By the way, it's Wynn with. I was just going to say it's
Wynn with a Y.
WYNN, as in sexual impropriety, not as in you will win if you go play there. The big difference that jumps out at you as you go to the Everett Encore Casino is that it is Las Vegas style, separate from local streetscape reality glitz. Quite different from MGM Springfield, where the whole point of the design was to build it into the fabric of the city. So these are your two in the new East Coast urban casinos. These are the two. I guess National Harbor would be the third, which is a separate model where you go there and it's a big, broad resort. These are the ways of looking at it. And so it in a way, it really, really, really doesn't fit into Boston at all, because it's not part of the streetscape. It's like you're going over the bridge from Somerville to Everett, which is an old industrial working class, now immigrant town, and boom, all of a sudden the Sands, the MGM Grand, it's right there with the big white gates and everything. The one way in which it does fit into Boston, and the thing that will save the southeastern Connecticut Native American casinos from demise in this, is that it's basically impossible to get to.
Like almost everything in Boston.
Yeah, there's not enough parking, the roads are inadequate to get to it, and there's no public transportation that leads to it. So it's basically impossible to get to. You have to spend 2 days to get there for one day.
There have been some conversations, Danielle, about when or if lawmakers ever get back together to vote on whatever else they're going to vote on over the course of the summer, whether or not we're going to talk any more about building more casinos in our state. What's the latest on that?
I don't really have a full update, but I mean, I think that
Seat tolls.
Yeah, and sports betting and marijuana and all the other things that we were told were definitely going to get done this year and still lay unfinished.
Yeah, and I think, and Colin, we've mentioned this before, is that building new casinos, you can make an argument, you can certainly not make an argument. Things like sports betting and marijuana, those are things that other states are doing. They're capturing revenues at currently. There seems to be a model set up for how that could work, and those also aren't getting done.
Right, and I think that is a distinction worth making. I mean, the problem with the casino thing is that nature abhors a vacuum, but also unnatural forces abhor a vacuum too. So if you don't have some kind of sensible casino policy, or one that's at least etched in stone, one which that you've crafted and pushed through the legislature, then you get all these Bridgeport moves and stuff like that. You get all these other proposals that are not great ideas that you're going to end up having to fight off. So, I mean, that's sort of that. But yes, as you're saying, there was a way to get some pretty quick money, quicker than tolls, which take some time to create. You could do it a lot faster with sports betting. You could do it probably a lot faster with illegal marijuana, and those things didn't happen either because of a lot of reasons. It might be unfair to pin it all on Ned Lamont. As Danny said, maybe it's also the legislature.
Well, let's turn in the last couple of minutes to some of our feats of strength, or maybe the grievances that we have this week. And Daniela, I'll start with you. What's on your mind?
Well, I've been looking back on my battered copy of Common Ground after the debate the other day, talking about busing. It's a flawed feat of strength. I mean, it's an amazing book. I know it's controversial, and I know it's kind of flawed. This is a book about busing in Boston in the 70s. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's quite extraordinary, but looking at it through today's eyes, you definitely cringe at some of the things. But it's really interesting. It's a profile of 3 families in Boston: African-American family, sort of a WASPy family, and a working class family in South Boston.
And it's as you say, worth another look.
Yes.
Even understanding the time in which it was written and reported.
Yeah, I think it's. It's extraordinary. It's very long and very detailed. It's it's sort of in the vein of a Robert Caro book, that kind of tome. But it's really interesting. But again, very flawed, and maybe the flaws are more evident now. 30 years later or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Danny, how about you?
My feat of strength is a list of the events happening this Saturday in the sleepy town of Hartford, Connecticut, where if people complain there's nothing to do, and I hate to sound like a city booster, or maybe I am. I know the mayor is going to be at every single one of these events. And quickly going through it: bilingual yoga at Pope Park, 10 a.m., Yard Goats versus Fisher Cats, Wiz Khalifa at Xfinity Theater, Hartford Athletics Soccer. What's that?
Pittsburgh native. Sorry.
Yes. Hartford Athletics Soccer inaugural game at Dillon Stadium, the newly redone Dillon Stadium at less than, never mind that. Cirque du Soleil down where the Cirque du Soleil is. Artist Showcase at Webster Theater. Connecticut Festival and Indie Games, part of the Connecticon. Paula Poundstone at Infinity Hall. CT Improv Comedy Night. Riverfest Food Truck Festival. And to top it off, the Riverfest fireworks. We're not going to mention Kyone Wolf's Friday night mouth off at the Mark Twain House, but let's throw that in because that's close enough to Saturday. But seriously, all kidding aside, this is one of these nights where it's just an amazing amount of stuff happening without ever even having anything at the Bushnell.
Almost too much stuff for people to take in all of it.
Well, I figured out you could go to 8 of the 12 that I just mentioned, depending on how you time out.
If you want to time out your day?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good list. Thank you, Danny. Okay.
Danny and I are sort of on the same page for once, because I want to talk a little bit about music in the summertime too. And I would just add to his list, although it doesn't fit in his time frame. Monday Night Jazz began this past Monday. It was about as big a crowd as I've seen at Monday Night Jazz in a really long time. And yes, the mayor is there. He's facing a mayoral campaign, so you count on him to be circulating around. But music. Summer and music to me go very much together, and yeah, we're all feeling a little bruised and battered by some of the public policy fights that the state has been through. Those of us who cover this stuff probably feel it more, but you need something to make you feel a lot better. And I think summer music is wonderful. I would add Self Suffice, Kaim the rap poet. He has several names. He's been a good friend of NPR. He'll be performing in front of the Old State House Thursday at noon. And I wanted just to add one last thing, because we're not going to get to do the nose about it this week. If you can go see the Pavarotti movie, it's playing at Real Artways, it's playing at the Madison Theater, and I think it's playing somewhere down in the New Haven area too. This is, even if you don't like opera, even if you don't like Pavarotti, just go see this movie. I'm not going to say anything more about it. It will remind you of what art is and what art can do and what it can mean in one life and a lot of lives.
So these are all very good ones. I'm going to give a couple feats of strength to some pieces of reporting I really like this week. One is the NPR Politics podcast. They've been doing a really cool thing in which Tamara Keith, who is a national correspondent for NPR, is partnering with New Hampshire Public Radio and Iowa Public Radio to try to profile some of the presidential candidates. And this week, she and Josh Rogers sit down with Tulsi Gabbard, someone whose presidential campaign I've not been paying all that close attention to. But I will say in about a 20-minute podcast, you get more newsworthy questions and newsworthy answers out of this one candidate than I've heard in any political sit-down in a very long time. So it's this week's NPR Politics podcast. I would commend people to read the New York Times editorial board's piece, Can States Just Say No to Corporate Giveaways? This is something we talk an awful lot about here. They take a look at one of the biggest issues in the entire country, which is the cross-state battle between Kansas and Missouri that's been going on for years and years and has people crossing over the river, just taking state money left and right to just try to game the system. It's very much worth a read. And I will also say, we mentioned this earlier, John Lender's piece, FBI recording device inside eyeglass case used in lottery probe. All you really need is the headline there to say that's probably something that you want to take a closer look at. I want to thank Danny Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media, Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant, and our own Colin McEnroe. Thanks so much to Scott Breedy for producing The Wheelhouse, Katie Tolarski, our executive producer, Kyone Wolf, our technical producer. This is The Wheelhouse.